No video. No video. Well, I hope everyone is doing well this evening. If you don't have a copy of the notes for tonight, Ken has them in the back. I'm trying to make sure that our guys have cut the video feed for a few moments. And we'll pick back up once we get through with the prayer requests in a few minutes. But as you can tell, Terry is not here tonight. together for our study. Yes. Well, as you're making your way back towards your seats, we will take in Galatians again, and we're in Galatians chapter 5. We're in verses 13 through 15 tonight. This is the lesson that we would have had 2 weeks ago, but y'all decided we had to eat and have a little party on a Wednesday night, and so which don't hear me begrudging it. I'm all up for eating and having a party, but tonight is our lesson on looking at, we've been talking about the case for freedom and how the Judaizers that Paul is addressing through the book of Galatians, they have basically told, just as a refresher, that the Judaizers have told the people in Galatia that what Paul has taught them about Christ is missing something. That instead of it being you get saved and Jesus is all you need, they're saying, but you also need to follow these parts of the law, circumcision, dietary restrictions, and certain other things. And so that's what the whole letter of Galatians is about. And we've been looking at how Paul, in the book of Galatians, has literally written a case for freedom. That's what he's done in this, is basically saying, look, do not listen to the Judaizers. Do not think that salvation and a relationship with Jesus is not enough, because that's all you need for salvation. And so tonight we are looking at the law versus freedom, and really looking at what freedom means to us in our faith. Now, I do have a story to share with you, as I generally do as we get started. There was a Persian general who told the story of what he would do when a spy was captured. This man gave the spies a choice. They could face the firing squad, or they could face whatever was behind a big black door. So you could either get door number 1, which is the firing squad, or door number 2, which could be whatever your imagination could conjure up. Okay? And so the spies almost always chose the firing squad. And when asked about it, the general said they always preferred the known way versus the unknown way. And so he said it is characteristic of people to be afraid of the undefined, the unknown, so to speak. But we gave them a choice. He was asked, well, what was behind the door? Was it a lion? Was it a bear, a tiger? Something that's just going to maul them or something like that? And the general replied, freedom. He said, I've only known a few brave enough to take it. So they could either go before the firing squad or walk out as a free person. But the fear of what might be behind that door was enough to get them to choose death over life, death over freedom. And so why would people choose the firing squad? It's because of that very real fear of the undefined, the unknown that they had. Now, what are some things that you think of that might be going through that person's mind as they look at the firing squad and they look at the black door? What are some of the things you think they might have thought would have been behind the black door? What do you think? Another firing squad. That would be awful, wouldn't it? I mean, there are 2 firing, yeah. What else? A hangman's noose? Some sort of torture? A guillotine? Oh, yeah, for sure. Anything else? I mean, I mentioned the lions and tigers and bears. Oh, my, thank you. I didn't even have to say that. A fire, did somebody say a fire? Or maybe drowning or something like that. So you can imagine that you're standing here and you've got the choice, and your mind is running rampant with ideas. There is just no way to imagine or figure out what was on the other side of that door. But they knew the very real reality of the firing squad, and so that was the case for those. But freedom, when we think about it, freedom can be sometimes a very scary thing. And the reason for that is it's easier and it's simpler to be told what to do and how to do it and to know what is coming. Sometimes it's easier when it's regimented and you know what to expect and there's no surprises. And is there anybody else like the pastor who likes a good regimen and likes know what's coming, and not that you're type A controlling, but anybody else like to sort of know what's coming. Yeah, we all do, right? To some degree, we all like to know what our routine may be, or what's going to happen, or something along those lines. And a lot of times that's easier and simpler for us. It requires less effort and work and nervousness about what is coming up. I told Misty after we got back from Pennsylvania, and we were talking about the fact that we were going to most likely find somewhere new to go and serve on a mission trip. I said, there is something about the familiarity, though, of going to the same place, that you become familiar with where the hotel is, you become familiar with where the church is, you know where the streets are, you know where certain restaurants are that you're going to eat at every time, like Marlin's, the sub shop that we always ate at. It was comfortable, it's familiar. But to go away from that and go to a different city or a different place, there's the unknown. There's the worry. Well, are we going to find a hotel in a good part of town? Are we going to, all these things. And so, when we think about how Christ has freed us from being controlled by sin, though, and he's rescued us or freed us from being slaves to false gods as well. And so tonight we're going to look at freedom, though, and what it really means for us, and what a free life looks like. And so would you agree that freedom is one of the greatest gifts that Christ has ever given us? I mean, it is, right? I mean, he set us free from the bondage, the captivity to sin. And so for us, that freedom is important. It's wonderful. And so tonight, as we look at Galatians 5, verses 13 through 15, we're going to look at 3 reminders about freedom. And the first one is to borrow from Monopoly, get out of jail free, right? And so we see that in verse 13, part A, if you want to call it that. And it says, you, my brothers and sisters, were called to be free. And so, when we think about it, Christ calls us from our old life, and he offers us freedom. Our old life is about bondage. Our old life is about captivity to sin, and sin being our master, sin having control over us. And so Jesus comes and calls us out of that old life, and he's giving us freedom. And so when we are saved, our old life is crucified and a new one begins. And that's sometimes hard for us to really wrap our heads around, but that old person that we were is crucified with Christ. I know you've heard that taught before, either by myself or by other people, but that is the reality of what happens to that old sinful person that is us pre-Christ. And that old person that we were is crucified. As when we do baptism, what does baptism signify besides us following Jesus' example and a public profession to those in attendance that we have followed Christ? But a baptism is a symbol of the death, burial, and resurrection of the old person into a new life. And that's what baptism represents for us. And so that's what Christ did for us. He has set us free in that regard. Now, you don't have to turn there. I'm going to read this to you, but it's in Ephesians chapter 2. It's verses 1 through 3. And so pay attention to your fill in the blank there below where it says about Ephesians chapter 2. I'll read verse 1, and we'll figure out what we were in our old life. It says, so verse 1 says this, as for you, you were dead in your transgressions and sins. So what's number 1? We were dead. We were dead spiritually because of our sins and our transgressions. And then number 2 has two things that we were used to be. It says, in which you used to live when you followed the ways of this world and of the ruler of the kingdom of the air, the Spirit who is now at work in those who are disobedient. So we followed the what? The ways of the world. Meaning that the ways of the world was the things that Satan does in this world to orchestrate mankind's demise. We followed those ways. because those seemed normal to us. They seemed natural to us. But we also see that we were what by the enemy? We were controlled by the enemy. And so when when you think about it, it's almost as if we were puppets on a string and following the way of the world and being controlled by Satan, that we were following his direction, so to speak. But then verse 3 tells us the last thing, that we were a slave to something. Let's see what it says. It says, all of us also lived among them at one time, gratifying the cravings of our flesh and following its desires and thoughts. Like the rest, we were by nature deserving of wrath. So we were a slave to our desires. That's what we see as typical of our pre-Christ life, is that we were following the ways of the world. Satan was using us as a puppet, but not only that, we were a slave to our sinful desires, because those sinful desires seemed natural to us. Because we have a sin nature, we naturally have a bend towards sin. I mean, think about that. Do we have to teach kids to sin? Do we have to teach kids to be greedy and not want to share their toys? No. What do we have to teach them? We have to teach them to share. We have to teach them not to hit other kids. We have to teach them not to bite other kids. We have to teach them what it means to not live or pursue that sinful nature. We have to teach them those things. And the reality of that is that when we're born, we have that sin nature, and even as we grow up, the sins don't change, the packaging just changes. And so as we grow older, sin is still there. Sin is still a temptation to us. And so what happens to us as we grow up? We have to learn, after we become a Christian, how to lean and bend more towards Christ than following that sinful nature. But it says there in your handout that for us, sin is no longer our master. A Christian's master is Christ. And so what are some slave masters that non-Christians obey? What are some slave masters that non-Christians follow or obey? Say that again. Drugs, all right. Social media. Money. There's about 3 of you said that at one time. Is there a something I need to know? No, I'm just picking. But there's a lot of things, right? I mean, when we think about it, there are a lot of things that non-Christians will obey, that they will follow, and they will pursue those things. And they see those as their master. Whether they want to label it that or not, that is the reality of it. That slave to greed, that slave to whatever, or that master of greed or whatever is ruling them. And so let me ask you this. Which one is a better master? Jesus or worldly things? Jesus, right? Because he is a master who actually is concerned about us. He's a master who is honestly loving us, that is concerned about our daily events and the things going on in our lives. And he wants to be intimately involved in our life, in every aspect of our life. And the master of sin doesn't care as long as we are constantly consuming. That's all that it's concerned about, is making sure that we are constantly consuming whatever that master is, whatever that sin is, and constantly being a part of that. That's all. It's just, that's the only thing that it worries about. Now, the second reminder we have about freedom tonight comes from the second part of verse 13, and this is that we don't live in the past. And so look at the second part of verse 13 with me. It says, "But do not use your freedom to indulge the flesh. Rather, serve one another humbly in love." So when we are saved, when we come to that salvation experience and we become a Christian, we are no longer a slave to sin. Jesus cuts the chains, breaks the chains, however you want to look at it, and he sets us free. He sets us free from sin in that regard. And so what Jesus wants from us, it's basically like he's looking at us saying, now don't go back to your old sinful ways of living. Instead, live in the freedom that I've given you. And so Jesus has set us free. He's unlocked that door for us to move forward in relationship with him, and he's saying, don't go back through the door. Don't go willingly put the chains back on to sin. He's saying, I've set you free, and at a very high price to myself, don't go back to it. Instead, live in the freedom that I've given you. And so in your handout there, it tells you the phrase, depending on the translation that you use, it may say indulge the flesh or indulge the sinful nature. And we've learned recently why that's a little different in different translations. So I don't have to explain that. But indulge the flesh or indulge the sinful nature could be translated from the original language as make a base for sin to attack from. And so when we indulge that sinful nature, when we indulge the sins of the flesh or whatever kind of sin is captivating to us, when we do that, basically what we're doing is we have stepped across the battle line into enemy territory and are waiting for them to jump off from that point and attack us. That's the idea of what happens when we indulge that sin, because we're no longer on Jesus' side of the line when we go into enemy territory, so to speak, looking for that sin and trying to participate in that sin. At that point, we've given them free rein to have a jumping off point. We've given that sin or those sins an opportunity to attack. And so, as it says there in your handout, think of one way that people indulge their sinful nature. Now, this is just a rhetorical question, but think about it. What is one way that people indulge their sinful nature? And now think of a way to strengthen your new nature. So think about the way that people, there's hypothetically, there's plenty of options for us to pick from, but just think about that. Think of one way that people indulge their sinful nature. But then think about how they could strengthen their new nature against that. Somebody mentioned, I think, Joanne, you mentioned drugs earlier as one of those things that people follow. Well, if, a lot of times what you see in the recovery process for those that have become addicted to drugs or had trouble with drugs is that when they get clean, the best thing, one of the best results for them a lot of times is when you take them out of their old environment and they're no longer around a lot of times or sometimes there is a good response to the recovery process and a continued ongoing recovery process for that person. And that's the same thing for us when we think about it. When we know that a particular sin is the one that captivates us, we have a particular sin that gets in our way, that seeks to make us a slave again, then what we have to do is we have to remove ourselves from the environment that offers that. If that means we have to have certain safeguards in place, then we need to do that. If that means that we have an accountability partner, if that means that we have safeguards on our PCs or our TVs or whatever it may be, we have to put those in place so that we can strengthen, as it says there in your handout, strengthen our new nature by saying, look, I'm going to pursue my new nature, this relationship with Christ, which is contrary to what the world wants, which is contrary to what the world is force-feeding us so often. And so people... gossip is that's... Yeah. You don't have to be a non-believer to gossip, for sure. And like I said, we could come up with all kinds of... we could sit here and make a long laundry list of those things that draw us back into that sinful nature, whether it's gossip or this or that or the other. But people think, though, that some people think when they get saved that they can allow just a little bit of sin back into their lives and I can control it. I'm not going to be like everybody else, or I'm not going to be like so-and-so. I can control it. And the problem is it's delusional. They're fooling themselves. They're lying to themselves in that regard because sin attacks us. Sin is not nice and polite and says, well, if you really want to be in control, I'll let you be in control. Sin doesn't work that way. Sin attacks us. Is there anything nice about a grizzly bear attacking someone? Well, guess what? Sin makes a grizzly bear look like a warm, cuddly puppy. And that's the reality of it because sin takes no prisoners. Sin will attack and keep attacking us. And ultimately what that sin will do is it will fight for control. And guess who loses when sin starts fighting for control? Most of the time, we do. We lose control, and so that's the whole reason that we have to pursue and strengthen that new nature. So, what is the best way to handle sin, as it says in your handout there? What's the best way to handle it? Okay, renew your walk with Christ or strengthen your walk with Christ. What? Confess it. Any other suggestions? Pray, for sure. And so, those are some very, wise answers for us on how to handle sin. And it's not from the point of, oh, well, I'm going to let a little bit of sin in my life and I'm going to do these things to make it manageable. No, because when we pray, when we renew our walk with Christ, when we confess it, when we do those things, we're going to be more apt to see our sin for what it really is and what it does to us, how it spiritually separates us from God, and how it keeps us from being sensitive to God's Holy Spirit. And so, it doesn't make any sense for us to allow that former slave master back into our lives. We've been freed from sin, and it's a thing of the past. So we don't want to live in the past. We don't want to go back to that. And so in your handout it says, does our freedom mean that we can do anything we want, including sin? Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it. There is, to some degree, liberty in our freedom, but we have to be mindful of that, because if we're not careful, what we'll find is that we will start trying to justify sin by saying, I've been set free, I can do this, and it's not as big a problem, or I can do that, and it's not going to hurt me the same way. But if it's sin, it's sin. It doesn't matter whether we're a believer or whether we're a non-believer. Sin is sin, and it is going to wreak havoc on our lives. And Paul answers the question very clearly there in Romans 6:1-2 in your handout. He says, shall we go on sinning so that grace may increase? By no means. We died to sin. How can we live in it any longer? And so why would we, he's making the argument there in Romans 6 that, I'll sin. It's okay for me to sin because there's always going to be more grace. And so there'll be more grace for me from Christ whenever I sin. So it's not going to be that big of a deal. But he says, no, that's not the way it works. We died to sin, meaning that we died with that old person that was crucified, that old person, that sinful person that was buried and died. And we can no longer live like that. We can't live like that. And so in your handout, there's a term there, libertinism. And it's a belief that we can do anything we want. And more so, even in the Christian church, but more so in society, it says to have loose morals or live without restraint, meaning that we can live, it's that whole idea of liberty, that we can, we're saved, so we have this whole idea of I'm saved so I can do whatever I want. I can live however I want without restraint. There's nothing to worry about, and that's a very dangerous place to live. So how do you think God feels about our choices to sin? How do you think it affects him, or how does he respond? It saddens him, right? It hurts him. I think the phrase we sometimes hear is when we sin, it breaks God's heart. I mean, it's no different than when we watch our own children do something and we're like, I really know you shouldn't do that, and I've tried to warn you, and I've done everything I can as a parent to get you not to do that, and you do it anyway. It's that whole mentality. It's that same whole idea with God, because when he sees us sin, he's sitting there, I warned you. I've done this. I've done that. I've shown you through Scripture. Jesus spoke about it, whatever it may be, and yet we still do it. And we still sin. It breaks his heart, just like it breaks our heart as parents. But let's think about it from our perspective. How should we feel about our choices to sin? How should we feel about them? Say that again. Guilty. The same. We should be grieved by it. We should have a holy guilt, not a guilt that Satan uses to sort of beat us down and make us lose our focus from Christ. But, the Holy Spirit bringing conviction in that way in our life. And then what did you say again, Sheila? Right. We should be brokenhearted. I think that when we get to heaven, if we get a glimpse of what our sin looks like from an eternal perspective, from God's perspective, I think we are going to be in absolute dismay. We're going to be so shocked that we were so trivial about certain sins, that we were so trivial about certain things, that we didn't take a stand, that we didn't do what we had to fortify our relationship so that our new nature was stronger, so that we would avoid those. Because when we get a glimpse of it from an eternal perspective, I think we're going to be in shock. But the third and final reminder we have comes from verses 14 and 15, and that is that you got to love them. And we'll see this right here in regards to our neighbors, so to speak. But it says, "For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. If you bite and devour each other, watch out, or you will be destroyed by each other." And, the interesting thing is that when we look in, specifically in Matthew chapter 5, it's verse 17, we're told that Christ did not come to do away with the law that the Judaizers are trying to apply to salvation that Paul is warning them about, that he's warning the Galatians about. Christ didn't didn't abolish the law. He came and he what? He fulfilled the law. He come to be the complete fulfillment of the law. And by doing that, he not only fulfilled the law, but he summed up the law in one word, and that's love. And that's what we see in Jesus, is that, we've been set free to love others like Christ loved us. And that's hard to do, because you know what? We're not always so lovable, are we? Are there days when we're less than lovable or less than likable? There are, right? And why is that? Because we're human. Because sometimes we say stupid stuff. Sometimes we do stupid stuff. And because of that, it makes it sometimes really hard to love us. Even our spouse who loves us and has, made a vow that they're going to love us and that they're going to, be there with us and they're going to do life with us, there are plenty of times where we do something and we're not very lovable. But Jesus tells us that because he's loved us, we're supposed to love others that same way, even when that person is not very lovable. Even when we may love them in Jesus, but we don't really like them. We can label it however we want, but Jesus wants us to love them the same way he's loved us. And I think the thing that we have to understand when we look at this is the fact that love is one of the most important themes of the Bible. It is definitely one of the most important themes. And again, we've been talking about translations on Sunday night, so I have one translation's numbers. I didn't do several of them. But the word love itself appears in the NIV New Testament over 250 times. So think about that. 250 times in just the New Testament. And so it's remarkable when we look at that and see it for what it really is, that there is a big emphasis on love, or what we love. And it's important that we see that. Now, in your handout there, those last three questions, we'll just look at those as rhetorical, but what is one way to show love to your family? Or what's a way to show love to your friends? Or to those people who dislike you? I think on some level we all want to please others, to some degree. I mean, there are some people who take it way too far and they just want to be a people pleaser and they got to make sure nobody's ever mad at them, and and that sometimes that's the personality. But then there are times where we have to figure out this person just does not like me. How do I handle that? But how do I show them love? How do I love them? How do I love my family? How do I love my friends? Because we see that that's what Jesus expects of us. Whether the person likes us or not, we're supposed to love them like Jesus would love them. And that's hard to do. When that person cuts you off on the highway and you really don't want to wave at them this way, guess what? You still got to love them like Jesus would. And so, for us, when you give a person freedom and you give them the freedom to do what they want, you can learn a lot about them. There's a whole lot, when you do that, you can sort of see what is a priority to them. You can find out what is, means a lot to them and different things like that. But when they use it for good to show God's love, then you know that God has changed them. And that's the beauty of what we see in Galatians, and specifically in this chapter 5, is that it shows us that when we're given that freedom, if we revert back to that old sin nature, it tells a lot about us. But if we are instead given that freedom and we pursue Christ and we pursue that strengthening that new nature that he has given us, then it says something completely different about us. And so that is our study for tonight in Galatians chapter 5. And want to let you know that Sunday we will, first off, if you, in case you haven't got the phone tree or didn't hear the message on the phone tree, if you were planning to do the Good News Club training thing, volunteer training thing this Saturday, it's been postponed. So I just wanted to make mention of that. The Good News Club is the after-school Bible club that we're working with to potentially do, hopefully at Ray Childers. And so that training has been postponed. As far as Sunday goes, Sunday morning we will be wrapping up our series on David, and we're going to look at him as the greatest king in Israel, and Jesus as the King of Kings. And so that'll be Sunday morning. Sunday night we will be looking at the NIV in our translation study, and so hope that you'll be here for that on Sunday night. And then next Wednesday night we will be into the next text in Galatians. So those are the things coming up, and I think that is about it. We did have a meeting tonight with our teams that will be doing the food for the Wednesday night meals. And so I would encourage you, if you're planning to come and eat at the meals, be sure to sign up if you have not already, so that we can get a really good ballpark idea of how many people are going to be here, because we don't want to fix for 40 and 75 show up, but we don't want to fix for 75 and 40 show up. And so we're trying to make sure that we're good stewards of the money that we use for it and that sort of thing. And so if you've got any questions, see Pastor Jake, or I may be able to answer your questions on it as well. And so that will be starting 2 weeks from tonight, I guess. Is that right? 2 weeks? Y'all are team 1, right? Okay, so in 2 weeks we'll be starting that. And so be sure to get signed up. And what's on the menu that night? Spaghetti. All right, spaghetti and salad. Okay, and Mike's making sure ribeyes is the next time, correct? So, but anyway, so we'll be doing that. It'll be a great time of fellowship. So I encourage you to come out and enjoy a meal. So I'm going to ask Joseph if he would to close us out with a word of prayer, and we'll be dismissed.